Russia had gone out of its way to prove its power to the whole world, when it considered it its duty to wave its flag wherever it went. And America felt threatened. If Russia becomes a superpower, then our time will not be equal to a penny, so America made a move to block the way of Russia, and with the help of Pakistan, the mouth of the sacks of dollars opened. And with the help of the then army decided to form a small group within a few days, which was also supported by the government of Pakistan, and the soldiers of Pakistan were engaged in training the people in it. All this was being done by the will of America, so that America wanted me to go ahead of Russia. At the same time, Russia makes a mistake. It accidentally teases the people of Afghanistan, who block Russia's path for a year, and the United States has high hopes that these are the people who can block Russia's path. With the help of Saudi Arabia, the news channel of Saudi Arabia started talking about jihad. With the help of the government of Pakistan, they started supporting the people of that time. And he started helping the people of Afghanistan in every way, and became a strong supporter of adding the students of the new seminary to this congregation. And the name of this party is known to the world as Taliban. We will tell the whole history of the Taliban to the people, of which you are watching part 1, how these people showed the stars to America during the day and also at night, and how America established its rule over the whole world. Why had he decided to eliminate them for consolidation? In September 1994, the Taliban rose to prominence during the Afghan Civil War, primarily made up of students, lib, from the eastern and southern Pashtun regions who had received their education in traditional Islamic schools, madrassas. Led by Mullah Omar, 1996 to 2001, the group expanded across Afghanistan, moving power from the mujahideen warlords. By 1996, they controlled about 3/4 of the nation and founded the first Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. The Taliban's regime faced opposition from the Northern Alliance militia, which took control of northeast Afghanistan and was recognized by many as a continuation of the interim Islamic State of Afghanistan. The Taliban maintained their grip on the country until they were defeated following the US invasion of Afghanistan in December 2001. Many Taliban members sought refuge in Pakistan. Following their defeat, the Taliban initiated an insurgency against the US-supported Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and the NATO-led International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, during the war in Afghanistan. In May 2002, members who had been forced into exile established the Council of Leaders, Robbery Shura, in Quetta, Pakistan. Led by Hibatullah Akhundzada, the Taliban initiated a military campaign in May 2021, which led to the fall of Kabul on August 15, 2021, marking the Taliban's return to power in Afghanistan. This resulted in the dissolution of the Islamic Republic and the reinstatement of the Islamic Emirate. During their period in power from 1996 to 2001, the Taliban implemented a rigid interpretation of Sharia, or Islamic law, and faced widespread criticism for their atrocities against Afghan civilians, severe discrimination against religious and ethnic minorities, refusal of UN food aid to starving populations, destruction of cultural heritage sites, the ban on women's education and employment, and the outlawing of most music. The Taliban engaged in a cultural genocide against the Afghan populace by obliterating their historical and cultural documents, artifacts, and sculptures. After coming back into control in 2021, the government of Afghanistan saw its budget slashed by 80%, leading to widespread issues with not having enough food. The Taliban brought back a lot of the rules they had in place before, like prohibiting women from working in most positions, making it mandatory for women to cover their entire bodies with clothing like the burqa, preventing women from going out without a male relative, and stopping all schooling for girls. Etymology. The term Taliban is derived from Pashto, meaning students, with the plural form being lib. This term is borrowed from lib, utilizing the Pashto plural suffix on. In Arabic, libn translates to students, but it also denotes two students due to its dual nature, leading to some confusion among Arabic speakers. Since its introduction into English, Taliban has served not only as a plural noun for the collective group but also as a singular noun for an individual. For instance, John Walker Lind has been described as an American Taliban instead of an American Talib by some media outlets. This usage differs in Afghanistan, where a person or supporter of the group is identified as a Talib or a Talibha. Additionally, Taliban can also be interpreted as seekers. In English, the spelling Taliban has become more common than Taliban. In American English, the definite article is typically not used, and the group is referred to as the Taliban rather than Taliban. However, in English-language media in Pakistan, the definite article is consistently left out. Background: Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, 1978 to 1992. Following the Soviet Union's military intervention and takeover of Afghanistan in 1979, Islamic guerrilla fighters engaged in combat with the Soviet troops. Throughout the Soviet-Afghan War, virtually every leader of the Taliban had participated in battles for either the Hezb-i Islami Khalis or the Harakat-i-Inqilabi Islami groups within the mujahideen. President of Pakistan, Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq, was concerned about Soviet intentions to invade Balochistan, Pakistan, leading him to dispatch Akhtar Abdur Rahman to Saudi Arabia to seek backing for the Afghan resistance against Soviet forces. Subsequently, the US CIA and the Saudi Arabian General Intelligence Directorate, GIT, channeled financial support and military equipment to the Afghan rebels through the Pakistani Inter-Service Intelligence Agency, ISI. During the 1980s, approximately 90,000 Afghans, among them Mohammad Omar, received training from the ISI of Pakistan. Afghan Civil War, 1992 to 1996. In April 1992, following the collapse of the regime supported by the Soviet Union led by Muhammad Najibullah, numerous Afghan political groups came to a consensus on a peace and governance agreement known as the Peshawar Accord. This agreement established the Islamic State of Afghanistan and designated an interim government to oversee a period of transition. However, Gabudin Hekmatyar's Hezb-i Islami Gabudin, Hezb-i Wadad, and Ittihad-i-Islami were not part of this agreement. From the beginning, the state faced paralysis as various factions vied for dominance over Kabul and Afghanistan. The Hezb-i Islami Gabudin party did not acknowledge the interim government, and in April, it attempted to seize control of Kabul on its own, initiating a civil war. By May, Hekmatyar's forces began to attack government troops and the city of Kabul. Hekmatyar's groups received backing from Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, which enabled them to devastate half of Kabul. Iran supported Abdulali Mazari's Hezb-i Wadad forces, while Saudi Arabia backed the Ittihad-i-Islami faction. The conflict among these groups further intensified into a full-scale war. Because of the abrupt start of the civil war, the various government agencies, law enforcement bodies, and the judicial systems for the newly established Islamic State of Afghanistan were unable to establish themselves. There were widespread abuses committed by members of different groups. Attempts at peace, led by the Defense Minister Ahmad Shah Massoud, President Sibghatullah Mojahedi, and later President Burhanuddin Rabbani, who was the interim leader, or by representatives from the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, often failed within a matter of days. The rural areas in northern Afghanistan, which were under the leadership of Defense Minister Massoud, experienced a period of relative peace, and there was some effort to rebuild. The city of Herat, which was under the influence of an Islamic State ally named Ismail Khan, also saw a level of peace. On the other hand, the southern regions of Afghanistan were not controlled by either foreign-backed groups or the government in Kabul. Instead, they were governed by local figures like Gul Agha Sherzai and his forces. History: 1994. The Taliban consist of devout students, Talib, hailing from the Pashtun regions of eastern and southern Afghanistan, who received their education in the traditional Islamic schools of Pakistan. Additionally, Tajik and Uzbek students were part of this group, setting them apart from the mujahideen factions that were more focused on ethnic identity, highlighting their significant contribution to the Taliban's swift expansion and triumph. Education and motivation. In September 1994, Mullah Mohammad Omar and a group of 50 students established their organization in Kandahar, his birthplace. Omar had been attending the Sangai-Hisar Madrasa in Maiwand, located in the northern part of Kandahar province, since 1992. He was dissatisfied with the lack of implementation of Islamic law in Afghanistan following the fall of communist governance, and he and his comrades committed to eliminating warlords and criminals. A significant number of these students had previously served as commanders in the Afghan-Soviet War. Within a short period, the group attracted 15,000 students from Pakistan, primarily Afghan refugees who were pursuing their education in religious schools or madrassas, also referred to as Jamiat Ulama-Islami madrassas by some sources. To support the anti-Soviet resistance and foster a disdain for foreign occupiers among Afghan youth, the U.S. government secretly provided school materials that endorsed militant Islamic ideologies and featured pictures of weapons and soldiers. The Taliban utilized American textbooks but removed the pictures of human faces from them, aligning with their severe anachronistic and fundamentalist understanding of Islam. The United States Agency for International Development contributed millions of dollars to the University of Nebraska at Omaha in the 1980s, which the university utilized to support the creation and distribution of textbooks in local languages. The initial Taliban were driven by the distress of the Afghan populace, which they thought stemmed from the conflicts among Afghan factions that did not follow the Islamic moral principles. In their religious schools, they were instructed to strictly follow Islamic law. Pakistani involvement. The Pakistani government has consistently denied involvement in providing military aid to the Taliban through its diplomatic efforts, yet sources claim that Pakistan played a significant role, starting as early as October 1994, in the formation of the Taliban. The Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, which backed the Taliban in 1994 with hopes for a regime in Afghanistan that would be favorable to Pakistan, hoped for a favorable outcome. Despite claims that the Taliban received financial backing from Pakistan in 1995 and 1996, and that Pakistan supported the Taliban from the beginning, the relationship was tenuous. Statements from both the ISI and the Taliban early on showed the strained nature of their alliance. The ISI sought to exert influence, while the Taliban leadership balanced the need for independence with the desire to maintain support. The primary supporters in Pakistan included General Nazirullah Babar, who focused on geopolitics, such as opening trade routes to Central Asia, and Maulana Fazlur Rahman of the Jamiat Ulama-Islam, known as the Deobandists, who aimed to oppose the Jamaat-e-Islami and the rise of Wahhabism. The conquest of Kandahar. On November 3, 1994, the Taliban launched an unexpected assault and took over Kandahar city. By January 4, 1995, they had taken control of 12 provinces in Afghanistan. The militias in these regions often gave up without resistance. The leaders of Omar's forces were a blend of ex-small unit military officers and educators from madrassas. During this period, the Taliban gained favor due to their efforts to eliminate corruption, reduce crime, and improve safety by clearing the roads and the surrounding areas. 1995, September 1996. In an effort to solidify their dominance across Afghanistan, the Taliban grew from their base in Kandahar, taking over vast areas. By early 1995, they began advancing towards Kabul, but were met with a severe setback by the Afghan government's Islamic State of Afghanistan, led by Ahmad Shah Massoud. As they retreated from Kabul, Taliban soldiers began attacking the city with artillery, resulting in the deaths of numerous civilians. The press reported in March 1995 that, after the city's bombardment, the Taliban had lost much support among Afghans, being viewed as just another power-hungry group. Despite numerous challenges, the Taliban eventually seized control of the western city of Herat on September 5, 1995. Following claims by the recognized government that Pakistan was supporting the Taliban, a large crowd of people attacked the Pakistani embassy in Kabul the following day. On September 26, 1996, as the Taliban geared up for a significant attack, Massoud made the decision to retreat from Kabul to fight against the Taliban in the northeastern Hindu Kush Mountains, rather than face urban warfare in Kabul. On September 27, 1996, the Taliban took control of Kabul and set up the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Experts at the time saw the Taliban evolving into a tool for Pakistan's local goals. Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, 1996 to 2001. From 1995 to 2001, the Taliban's military objective was to restore the rule of Abdur Rahman, also known as the Iron Emir, by re-establishing a government dominated by Pashtun in the northern regions. They aimed to create an Islamic government based on law and order, adhering to a strict interpretation of Sharia law, following the Hanafi school of Islamic law and the religious teachings of Mullah Omar over the entire territory of Afghanistan. By 1998, the Taliban's rule had extended to 90% of Afghanistan. In December 2000, the UN Security Council in Resolution 1333 acknowledged the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, criticized the Taliban for using their territory to train terrorists, and condemned the Taliban for providing a safe haven for Osama bin Laden. As a result, the UN imposed strict sanctions on Afghanistan under Taliban rule. In October 2001, the United States, along with its allies, including the Afghan Northern Alliance, launched an invasion of Afghanistan, successfully overthrowing the Taliban regime. The Taliban leaders then sought refuge in Pakistan. Afghanistan during Taliban rule. In 1996, the Taliban seized control, following 2 decades of relentless conflict that had left Afghanistan's infrastructure and economy in ruins. The country lacked basic amenities such as running water, electricity, telephones, operational roads, and consistent energy sources. Essential items like food, water, and shelter were in extremely short supply. Moreover, the clan and family system that traditionally offered Afghans a social and economic support network had been severely disrupted. Afghanistan had the highest infant mortality rate globally, with a quarter of all children dying before their 5th birthday, a figure that was significantly higher than in most other developing nations. International charitable and/or development organizations, non-governmental organizations or NGOs, played a crucial role in providing food, employment, reconstruction, and other vital services. However, the Taliban were deeply suspicious of the aid provided by these organizations, as noted in United Nations and NGOs. With over 1 million deaths during the conflict period, the number of households led by widows had increased to 98,000 by 1998. In Kabul, which had seen extensive damage from rocket strikes, over half of its 1.2 million residents received some form of assistance from non-governmental organizations, NGOs, including access to drinking water. The civil conflict and the continuous influx of refugees persisted during the Taliban's rule. The offensives in the Mazar, Herat, and Shomali valleys led to the displacement of more than 750,000 people, employing scorched earth strategies to hinder their ability to provide support to the enemy. The Buddhas of Bamiyan, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, were demolished by Mullah Omar's command. Taliban leaders, especially Mullah Omar, rarely engaged in direct communication with non-Muslim foreigners, necessitating that aid organizations work through intermediaries whose decisions and agreements were frequently changed. In September 1997, the leaders of 3 UN agencies in Kandahar were removed from the country after voicing their opposition to a policy that required a female UN High Commissioner for Refugees attorney to speak from behind a curtain to conceal her identity. In an effort to meet the Taliban's requirements, the UN expanded its roster of Muslim female employees. Consequently, the Taliban mandated that all female Muslim UN employees traveling to Afghanistan must be accompanied by a mahram, a male relative, or a blood relative. By July 1998, the Taliban had forced the closure of all NGO offices in Kabul through military action, following the refusal of these organizations to relocate to a damaged former polytechnic college as directed. Just 1 month after this, the UN offices were also forced to close. As the cost of food increased and the situation worsened, Planning Minister Khairuddin Din Mohammed rationalized the Taliban's lack of concern over the cessation of humanitarian aid. We hold the belief that God the Almighty will provide for everyone in one form or another. The decision of the foreign NGOs to leave is theirs alone. We have not expelled them. However, the few remaining organizations in Kandahar were not bound by the same restrictions and were able to continue their work. Pakistani military's role during Taliban rule. The Taliban's origins can be traced back to 1994, when Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, played a significant role in their establishment. The ISI utilized the Taliban to set up a government in Afghanistan that would be advantageous to Pakistan, aiming to secure strategic advantages. Since their inception, the ISI and the Pakistani military have provided financial, logistical, and military backing to the Taliban. Ahmed Rashid, a Pakistani expert on Afghanistan, has estimated that between 1994 and 1999, between 80,000 to 100,000 Pakistanis served as fighters for the Taliban. Peter Thompson has reported that until the 9/11 attacks, Pakistani military and ISI officials, along with thousands of their own troops, were actively engaged in combat in Afghanistan. By 2001, various international reports indicated that between 28,000 to 30,000 Pakistanis, 14,000 to 15,000 Afghan Taliban members, and 2,000 to 3,000 Al-Qaeda operatives were engaged in combat against anti-Taliban groups, forming a military force estimated at around 45,000 strong. At that time, Pakistani President Pervez Musharraf, who was serving as the Chief of Army Staff, oversaw the dispatch of thousands of Pakistanis to fight alongside the Taliban and Osama bin Laden against the forces of Ahmad Shah Massoud. The document estimates that around 28,000 Pakistanis are currently engaged in combat in Afghanistan, with 8,000 of them being militants who were trained in madrassas and have since filled the ranks of the Taliban. It also mentions that the parents of these Pakistani fighters are unaware of their children's affiliation with the Taliban until they return to Pakistan. A 1998 report from the U.S. State Department verifies that between 20% and 40% of the Taliban's regular troops are Pakistani. Additionally, the State Department's findings, along with those from Human Rights Watch, indicate that the remaining Pakistani fighters in Afghanistan are professional soldiers, particularly from the Frontier Corps and the Army, who are providing direct support in combat. Human Rights Watch noted in 2000. In the context of foreign nations' involvement in Afghanistan's conflict, Pakistan stands out due to the broadness of its goals and the magnitude of its actions. These actions include seeking financial support for the Taliban, funding their operations, acting as the Taliban's unofficial ambassadors abroad, organizing training for Taliban fighters, recruiting both skilled and unskilled personnel for their armies, planning and executing military operations, facilitating the transport of weapons and fuel, and providing direct combat assistance. On August 1, 1997, the Taliban initiated an assault on Sheberghan, which served as the primary military base of Abdul Rashid Dostum. Dostum attributed the success of the attack to the participation of 1,500 Pakistani commandos and the support provided by the Pakistani Air Force. In 1998, Iran alleged that Pakistan had deployed its Air Force to conduct airstrikes on Mazar-i-Sharif in favor of the Taliban, and directly accused Pakistani soldiers of committing war crimes at Bamiyan. The same year, Russia claimed that Pakistan had contributed to the Taliban's military growth in northern Afghanistan by deploying a significant number of Pakistani troops, some of whom were later captured by the anti-Taliban United Front. By 2000, the UN Security Council had enacted an arms embargo against any military assistance to the Taliban, with UN officials specifically targeting Pakistan. The UN Secretary-General made veiled criticisms of Pakistan's military backing, and the Security Council expressed its deep concern over the Taliban's involvement in the conflict with thousands of non-Afghan nationals. In July 2001, numerous nations, among them the United States, alleged that Pakistan was breaching UN sanctions due to its support for the Taliban through military assistance. Additionally, the Taliban secured financial backing from Pakistan. By 1997, following the Taliban's takeover of Kabul, Pakistan contributed $30 million in assistance and an additional $10 million for the salaries of government officials. From 1996 to 2001, the Al-Qaeda factions led by Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri were recognized as a sovereign entity within the Taliban regime. Bin Laden dispatched fighters from the Arab and Central Asian regions to the conflict against the United Front, including his Brigade 055. The involvement of the Pakistani military has been noted by international analysts and the anti-Taliban leader Ahmad Shah Massoud as a gradual encroachment. Anti-Taliban resistance under Massoud. In the late 1990s, Ahmad Shah Massoud and Abdul Rashid Dostum, who had previously been adversaries, formed the United Front, Northern Alliance, in response to the Taliban's plans to launch attacks on the territories controlled by Massoud and those under Dostum's command. This alliance consisted of forces primarily from Tajikistan, led by Massoud, and Uzbekistan, under Dostum's command. Additionally, it included troops from the Hazaras, commanded by Haji Muhammad Mohakik, and Pashtun forces, led by figures like Abdul Haq and Haji Abdul Qadir. The United Front also boasted the support of prominent politicians and diplomats, such as Abdul Rahim Ghaforzai, Abdullah, and Massoud Khalili. From the Taliban's takeover of Kabul in September 1996 to November 2001, the United Front managed to maintain control over approximately 30% of Afghanistan's population in various provinces, including Badakhshan, Kapiza, Takhar, and parts of Parwan, Kunar, Nuristan, Lagman, Samangan, Kunduz, Ghor, and Bamyan. However, after years of intense conflict, particularly in the northern city of Mazar-i-Sharif, Abdul Rashid Dostum and his Junbish forces were ultimately defeated by the Taliban and their allies in 1998. Following this defeat, Dostum sought refuge abroad. Hamd Massoud was the sole significant opposition leader in Afghanistan who managed to protect extensive regions of his domain from Taliban attacks. Within his domains, Massoud established democratic structures and ratified the Women's Rights Declaration. In these areas, women and girls were not compelled to wear the Afghan burqa. They were permitted to engage in employment and education. At least 2 documented cases, Massoud directly took action against forced marriages. We hold the belief that both genders are endowed by a higher power and possess equal rights. Women are capable of education, career, and societal participation, roles traditionally held by men. Ahmad Shah Massoud, 2001. Massoud is firm in his stance that women in Afghanistan have endured centuries of subjugation. He argues that the societal norms of the nation oppress women, with the Taliban intensifying this oppression. His grandest endeavor is to break down these societal biases, thereby granting women more freedom, space, and equality, ensuring they enjoy the same rights as men. Pepe Escobar, Massoud, the transition from warrior to leader. It would take a generation or more for Afghan customs to change, and this could only happen through education, he noted. Humayun Tandar, who participated as an Afghan representative at the 2001 International Conference on Afghanistan in Bonn, mentioned that the barriers of language, ethnicity, and region were also oppressive for Massoud. That's why he aimed to forge a unity that would go beyond our current circumstances and continue to shape our future. This also extended to the barriers of religion. Jean-José Puig recounts instances where Massoud would lead prayers before meals or sometimes requested his Muslim peers to lead the prayer, yet he was also open to asking a Christian friend Jean-José Puig or a Jewish professor from Princeton University, Michael Berry. Jean-José, we share the same faith. Could you lead the prayer before lunch or dinner in your language? Human Rights Watch has documented no violations of human rights by the military units directly under Massoud's command from October 1996 until his assassination in September 2001. Pepe Escobar, Massoud, the transition from warrior to leader. It would take a generation or more for Afghan customs to change, and this could only happen through education, he noted. Humayun Tandar, who participated as an Afghan representative at the 2001 International Conference on Afghanistan in Bonn, mentioned that the barriers of language, ethnicity, and region were also oppressive for Massoud. That's why he aimed to forge a unity that would go beyond our current circumstances and continue to shape our future. This also extended to the barriers of religion. Jean-José Puig recounts instances where Massoud would lead prayers before meals or sometimes requested his Muslim peers to lead the prayer, yet he was also open to asking a Christian friend Jean-José Puig or a Jewish professor from Princeton University, Michael Berry. Jean-José, we share the same faith. Could you lead the prayer before lunch or dinner in your language? Human Rights Watch has documented no violations of human rights by the military units directly under Massoud's command from October 1996 until his assassination in September 2001. Ahmad Shah Massoud, 2001. The United Front proposed that the Taliban should participate in a political dialogue aimed at national democratic elections. In the early part of 2001, Massoud adopted a novel approach that combined local military tactics with international diplomatic efforts. There was a growing sense of discontent among the Afghan populace, particularly in the Pashtun regions, against Taliban governance. Massoud spread the message of popular agreement, universal elections, and democratic governance across the globe. Concurrently, he was cautious not to resurrect the unsuccessful Kabul government of the early 1990s. By 1999, he initiated the education of the Afghan police, training them to maintain public order and safeguard civilians should the United Front succeed. Massoud articulated, "The Taliban are not an unstoppable force. They are increasingly isolated from the populace. Their strength has diminished compared to previous times. Their survival is dependent on the support from Pakistan, Osama bin Laden, and other radical factions that sustain the Taliban. Without this support, their survival becomes exceedingly challenging." Ahmad Shah Massoud, 2001. Starting in 1999, a fresh initiative was launched by Tajik Ahmad Shah Massoud and Pashtun Abdul Haq to bring together all the different ethnic groups in Afghanistan. Massoud managed to bring together the Tajiks, Hazaras, Uzbeks, and some Pashtun military leaders under his United Front leadership. Meanwhile, the renowned Pashtun leader Abdul Haq saw a rise in defecting Pashtun Taliban members, as the Taliban's popularity was on the decline. Both leaders decided to collaborate with the exiled Afghan monarch Zahir Shah. When international officials engaged with the representatives of this new coalition, which Pulitzer Prize winner Steve Kalt described as the Grand Pashtun-Tajik Alliance, they remarked, "It's unbelievable that this is happening today. Pashtun, Tajiks, Uzbeks, Hazaras. They were all willing to commit to this effort, to serve under the king's flag for a more ethnically diverse Afghanistan." Senior diplomat and Afghanistan specialist Peter Thompson noted, "The Lion of Kabul, Abdul Haq, and the Lion of Panjshir, Ahmad Shah Massoud." Haq, Massoud, and Karzai, Afghanistan's three leading moderates, had the potential to bridge the gap between the Pashtun and non-Pashtun communities, as well as the north-south divide. The highest-ranking Hazara and Uzbek officials also played a role in this initiative. By the late 1990s, Massoud had successfully convened this new coalition in a northern Afghanistan gathering to deliberate on various issues, including the establishment of a Loya Jirga, or a traditional council of elders, aimed at resolving the political unrest in Afghanistan. This aspect of the Pashtun, Tajik, Hazara, Uzbek peace strategy eventually came to fruition. A report on the assembly by author and journalist Sebastian Junger notes, "In 2000, during my visit, it was a particularly intriguing period. Massoud gathered Afghan leaders from diverse ethnic backgrounds. They traveled from London, Paris, the USA, across Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India to join him in the northern region. He convened a council of distinguished Afghans from around the globe, there to discuss the future of the Afghan government following the Taliban. We had the opportunity to meet and briefly interview many of these men. One of them was Hamid Karzai. At the time, I had no clue about his future role." In the early months of 2001, Ahmad Shah Massoud, along with leaders from Afghanistan's various ethnic groups, made a plea to the European Parliament in Brussels, requesting assistance from the global community to aid the Afghan populace. He articulated that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda had propagated a distorted view of Islam, and emphasized that without backing from Pakistan and Osama bin Laden, the Taliban's military efforts would falter. During his European tour, he also issued a warning regarding an impending large-scale attack on the United States. Nicole Fontaine, the president of the European Parliament, referred to him as the symbol of freedom in Afghanistan. On September 9, 2001, at the age of 48, Massoud became the victim of a suicide bombing by two individuals who were actually terrorists disguised as journalists at Khwaja Bahauddin, a location in the Takhar province of Afghanistan. Despite surviving numerous assassination attempts over a span of 26 years, Massoud perished in a helicopter journey to a medical facility. The first attempt to kill Massoud was executed in 1975 by Hekmatyar alongside two ISI operatives at the mere age of 22. By early 2001, al-Qaeda's planned assassins had been captured by Massoud's forces as they attempted to breach his lands. The memorial service, although held in a more remote location, was greeted by the presence of numerous mourners, with the attendance estimated in the hundreds of thousands. The murder of Massoud is thought to be linked to the September 11, 2001, attacks in the United States, which resulted in the deaths of nearly 3,000 individuals, seemingly marking the terrorist act that Massoud had predicted in his address to the European Parliament a few months prior. John P. O'Neill, who specialized in counterterrorism and served as the FBI's assistant director until its later years, retired from the bureau and accepted the role of the director of security at the World Trade Center, WTC. He assumed this position the week before September 11. On September 10, 2001, O'Neill confided in two of his confidants, "We're due. We're on the cusp of a major event. Various events have unfolded in Afghanistan. I'm not comfortable with the current trajectory in Afghanistan. I feel a change is imminent, and I believe significant events are on the horizon." O'Neill passed away on September 11, 2001, following the collapse of the South Tower. Following the 9/11 attacks, Massoud's United Front Forces, along with Abdul Rashid Dostum, who had returned from exile, with support from American Air Forces, successfully removed the Taliban from power in Kabul through Operation Enduring Freedom. Between October and December 2001, the United Front secured much of the nation and played a pivotal role in the formation of the interim government under Hamid Karzai after the Taliban overthrow and a renewed war. War in Afghanistan, 2001 to 2021. Prelude. On September 20, 2001, the President of the United States, George W. Bush, addressed Congress in a joint session, expressing tentative blame on al-Qaeda for the events of September 11. He mentioned, "The leadership of al-Qaeda wields considerable sway over Afghanistan, and they back the Taliban regime in its control over much of the country." Bush denounced the Taliban's regime, and proceeded to announce, "Tonight, the United States of America announces the following demands from the Taliban, demands that will not be met through negotiation or discussion. Provide the United States with the whereabouts of all al-Qaeda leaders. Commit to the immediate release of any foreign citizens wrongly detained. Ensure the protection of foreign journalists, diplomats, and humanitarian workers. Shut down all terrorist training facilities. Surrender every terrorist and their allies to the rightful authorities. Allow the United States complete inspection access to all terrorist training facilities." The United States appealed to the global community to support a military operation against the Taliban. Following the events of September 11, the UN passed two decisions on terrorism. These decisions urged all nations to cooperate and implement fully the relevant international agreements concerning terrorism and outlined recommendations for worldwide consensus. A study summary from the House of Commons Library reveals that while the United Nations Security Council, UNSC, did not officially approve the military campaign led by the US, it was generally accepted as a justifiable act of self-defense under the UN Charter. This led the Council to swiftly approve a military action to restore stability in the country following the conflict. Furthermore, on September 12, 2001, NATO sanctioned a military operation in Afghanistan as a defensive measure against attacks. The Taliban envoy to Pakistan, Abdul Salam Zeef, reacted to the ultimatum by requesting strong evidence linking bin Laden to the attacks, asserting, "We believe that if the US has proof, they must share it." He also insisted that bin Laden should face trial in an Afghan court. Zeef also alleged that 4,000 Jews employed at the trade center were aware of the suicide attacks and were not present that day. This claim was largely viewed as a strategy to stall rather than a genuine effort to work with the ultimatum. On September 22, the United Arab Emirates and subsequently Saudi Arabia decided to no longer recognize the Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan, leaving only Pakistan as the country with diplomatic relations. On October 4, the Taliban proposed handing over Osama bin Laden to Pakistan for an international trial under Islamic Sharia law. However, Pakistan declined the proposal, citing concerns over ensuring his safety. On October 7, the Taliban's representative in Pakistan proposed to imprison bin Laden and conduct his trial under Islamic law in exchange for a formal request from the US and evidence of his involvement. A spokesperson for the Bush administration, speaking without attribution, dismissed the Taliban's proposal, indicating that the US would not entertain their requests. Coalition invasion. In the aftermath of the September 11 attacks, less than a month had passed before the United States, supported by the United Kingdom, Canada, and various nations, including several NATO members, launched a military campaign. The goal of these operations was to oust the Taliban from control and to deter terrorists from utilizing Afghanistan as a base for their activities. The CIA's top-tier Special Activities Division, SAD, units were the initial American troops to set foot in Afghanistan. This was not the first time. Many other countries' intelligence agencies were already present or operating in the region before the SAD units arrived. This was because, technically, the SAD units were made up of civilian paramilitary groups rather than traditional military personnel. They allied with the Afghan United Front, Northern Alliance, to get ready for the upcoming deployment of U.S. Special Operations Forces. Together, the United Front, Northern Alliance, SAD, and Special Forces successfully toppled the Taliban with minimal casualties among the coalition and without the involvement of international conventional ground forces. The Washington Post, in an editorial by John Lehman in 2006, highlighted this achievement. The Afghan campaign stands as a pivotal moment in the history of the U.S. military, not only because it was led by special operations forces from every branch, but also because it saw the combined strength of the Navy and Air Force, alongside the strategic efforts of the Afghan Northern Alliance and the CIA, playing crucial roles. The use of large army or marine divisions was notably absent. On October 14, the Taliban proposed a deal to surrender Osama bin Laden to a neutral nation in exchange for a ceasefire, contingent upon proof of bin Laden's culpability. The U.S. declined this proposal, opting to press forward with military operations. The city of Mazar-i-Sharif was captured by the United Front's forces under Ustad Adam Muhammad Noor and Abdul Rashid Dostum on November 9, setting off a domino effect as more provinces fell with little opposition. In November 2001, prior to the takeover of Kunduz by United Front forces led by Muhammad Dud, numerous high-ranking officials and regular soldiers from the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, along with agents from Pakistan's inter-services intelligence and military forces, along with additional volunteers and supporters involved in the Kunduz evacuation, were airlifted out of Kunduz by Pakistan's Army cargo planes to Pakistan's Air Force bases in Chitral and Gilgit in the northern areas. This operation was referred to as the Airlift of Evil by the U.S. military forces in Kunduz, and it became a commonly used term in news reports. On the evening of November 12, the Taliban moved south from Kabul. The following night, they freed 8 Western aid workers who had been held captive for 3 months. By November 13, the Taliban had pulled out of both Kabul and Jalalabad. Ultimately, in early December, the Taliban relinquished control of Kandahar, their final stronghold, scattering without officially surrendering. Targeted killings. The United States has engaged in targeted assassinations of Taliban leaders, primarily employing special forces and occasionally drones. The British military has adopted similar strategies, particularly in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. During Operation Herrick, British special forces were involved in the execution of at least 50 high-ranking and local Taliban figures in Helmand Province. The Taliban have also executed targeted assassinations. In 2011, they eliminated prominent figures opposing them, such as former Afghan President Burhanuddin Rabbani, the head of the police in northern Afghanistan, the leader of the elite anti-Taliban 303 Pamir Corps, Muhammad Dud, and the head of police in Kunduz, Abdul Rahman Said Kayli. All of these individuals were part of the Massoud faction within the United Front. The Guantanamo Bay indictment lists the United States Department of Defense's belief that the Taliban could sustain a 40-man covert unit known as Jihad Kandahar, which is utilized for covert operations, including targeted assassinations. Resurgence after 2001. Pakistan has faced accusations of persisting in backing the Taliban following the September 11 attacks on the United States, a claim Pakistan has vehemently denied. By mid-2002, Taliban leaders who had fled abroad started to re-establish connections with one another. They established the Quetta Shura in Quetta, a city in Pakistan. Following the Taliban's defeat in Kabul by forces opposed to them in November 2001, the ISI collaborated with and assisted Taliban groups that were in a state of retreat. Taliban fighters, Al-Qaeda members, and ISI agents were airlifted from Kunduz to Pakistan's northern areas by the Pakistan Army's cargo planes, which were then stationed at Pakistan's Air Force bases. Former Pakistani President Pervez Musharraf mentioned in his memoirs that Richard Armitage, the former U.S. Deputy Secretary of State, warned that Pakistan would be bombed back to the Stone Age for its support of the Taliban, though Armitage has since denied using that specific phrase. Hamid Karzai, the head of the Pashtun tribal group, was chosen as the national interim leader, and the Taliban handed over Kandahar after Karzai proposed a deal for amnesty. However, the U.S. did not agree to a section of the deal that allowed Taliban leader Mullah Omar to reside with dignity in Kandahar. The Taliban were not included in the Bonn Agreement of December 2001, which is often seen as a reason for the Taliban's resurgence on the battlefield and the ongoing conflict. This was partly because the Taliban seemed to be losing, but also because the U.S. made it clear that the Taliban were not welcome to participate. By 2003, the Taliban were beginning to regroup, and shortly after, their insurgency began. UN negotiator Lakhdar Brahimi acknowledged in 2006 that not inviting the Taliban to Bonn was our original sin. Between May and June 2003, top Taliban leaders declared their readiness to engage in guerrilla warfare to drive out American troops from Afghanistan. In the latter part of 2004, the previously undisclosed Mullah Omar declared a rebellion against America and its allies, referring to the transitional Afghan government forces, with the aim of reclaiming their nation's independence. On May 29, 2006, as reported by the American website The Spokesman Review, Afghanistan was under increasing attack from Taliban militants in rural areas. At the same time, a U.S. military convoy in Kabul lost control and crashed into 12 civilian cars, resulting in the death of one person and injuring 6 others. The incident sparked public outrage, leading to a full-day riot that claimed the lives of 20 people and injured 160 others. When the crowd began throwing stones and firing guns, the U.S. soldiers responded with their weapons, claiming self-defense as they fled the scene, according to a U.S. military spokesperson. A reporter from the Financial Times in Kabul mentioned that this was the beginning of a rising tide of anger and increasing animosity towards outsiders that had been escalating and accumulating since 2004, possibly also sparked by a U.S. airstrike a week prior in southern Afghanistan that resulted in the deaths of 30 civilians, whom she believed the Taliban were hiding in. The ongoing backing from local tribes and other groups in Pakistan, the drug business, and the limited presence of NATO troops, along with the deep-seated history of opposition and seclusion, showed that Taliban groups and their leaders were enduring. Suicide bombings and other forms of terrorism that were not prevalent in 2001 were on the rise. Experts argued that efforts to eliminate poppy crops, which negatively affected the lives of Afghans who had turned to poppy farming, and civilian casualties from airstrikes, encouraged the Taliban's comeback. These experts advocated for a strategy that emphasizes winning over hearts and minds, and on rebuilding the economy, which could benefit from redirecting efforts from stopping poppy farming to promoting the production of medicinal poppy. Commentators saw Islamabad's move from conflict to dialogue as a strategy to soothe rising dissatisfaction. The Taliban's hierarchical setup meant that the killing of Mullah Dadullah in May 2007 didn't significantly alter the situation, except to strain nascent ties with Pakistan. For years, former Afghan President Hamid Karzai, along with the British and Pakistani authorities, had pushed for negotiations, while the American government opposed them. Karzai proposed discussions with the Taliban in September 2007, but the group quickly turned down the offer, arguing against the involvement of foreign forces. On February 8, 2009, U.S. military leader in Afghanistan General Stanley McChrystal and his team announced that the Taliban's top leaders were in Quetta, Pakistan. By that time, a robust insurgency had formed, known as Operation Al-Fath, which means victory from the Quran, and it took the shape of a guerrilla conflict. The Pashtun tribal community, with over 40 million members, including Afghans and Pakistanis, had a history of resisting foreign forces, suggesting that the Taliban might represent just a fraction of the larger insurgency. The bulk of Taliban fighters were newcomers, mainly from local schools. In December 2009, the Asia Times online news outlet announced that the Taliban had proposed to the U.S. official assurances that Afghanistan would not be utilized for hostile actions against other nations, but the U.S. had not replied. By July 2016, the U.S. Time magazine had calculated that 20% of Afghanistan was under Taliban control, with the southernmost Helmand province being their main base, while U.S. and Global Resolute Support Coalition leader General Nicholson in December 2016 also mentioned that 10% was under Taliban control, with an additional 26% of Afghanistan being contested by the Afghan government and various rebel groups. On August 7, 2015, the Taliban were responsible for the deaths of approximately 50 individuals in Kabul. In August 2017, following a critical speech by U.S. President Trump, a Taliban spokesperson responded by stating their determination to continue fighting against the American invaders to liberate Afghanistan. In January 2018, a Taliban suicide bomber caused the deaths of more than 100 people in Kabul by detonating a bomb in an ambulance. By 2020, following the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIL's significant territorial losses and a decrease in terrorist activities, the Institute for Economics and Peace, a global research organization, identified the Taliban as emerging as the most perilous terrorist entity globally, thanks to their recent efforts to expand their territory. On May 29, 2020, it was announced that Mullah Yaqub, the son of the Taliban's leader Mullah Omar, had taken over as the Taliban's leader following the illness of several members of the Quetta Shura, a Taliban decision-making body, due to COVID-19. This was confirmed on May 7, 2020, when Yaqub was appointed as the Taliban's military leader by the Quetta Shura. Among those affected by COVID-19 in the Quetta Shura, which persisted in conducting face-to-face meetings, were Hibatullah Akhundzada and Sirajuddin Haqqani, the commanders of the Taliban and the Haqqani network, respectively. Diplomatic negotiations. Abdul Ghani Baradar, the co-founder and the second highest-ranking figure in the Taliban, was a key leader who supported engaging in discussions with the United States and the Afghan authorities. It was reported that in February 2010, the administration of President Karzai had conversations with Baradar. However, by the end of that month, Baradar was captured during a combined operation by the United States and Pakistan in Karachi, Pakistan. This capture angered Karzai and raised doubts about his arrest, suggesting that it was due to the Pakistani intelligence's opposition to Afghan peace negotiations. Following his victory in the 2009 Afghan presidential election, Karzai announced his intention to convene a peace jirga in Kabul, aiming for peace. The assembly, which included 1,600 participants, was held in June 2010, yet, the Taliban and the Hezb-i Islami Gabudin, who were invited by Karzai as a sign of friendship, did not participate in the event. In 2010, there was a shift in the approach of the Obama administration towards considering political talks as a means to end the conflict. The Taliban had previously refused to engage with the Afghan government, viewing them as puppets of the Americans. Following the initial peace negotiations between the U.S. and the Taliban, sporadic attempts at further dialogue took place. It was announced in October 2010 that the Taliban's top commanders, known as the Quetta Shura, had escaped their base in Pakistan and were safely transported to Kabul by NATO planes for discussions, with the promise that NATO personnel would not detain them. However, it was later revealed that the leader of this Taliban delegation, identified as Akhtar Mansour, who was supposed to be the second-in-command of the Taliban, was actually an imposter who had deceived NATO officials. In June 2011, President Karzai confirmed the existence of secret negotiations between the U.S. and the Taliban, but these efforts fell apart by January 2012. Attempts to restart the negotiations were also abandoned in March 2012 and June 2013 due to a disagreement between the Afghan government and the Taliban over the latter's decision to establish a political office in Qatar. President Karzai criticized the Taliban for presenting themselves as a legitimate government in exile. In July 2015, Pakistan became the host for the first formal peace talks between Taliban representatives and the Afghan government. The talks, facilitated by Pakistan, also included observers from the US and China. In January 2016, Pakistan was the host of a series of discussions involving officials from Afghanistan, China, and the United States, but the Taliban chose not to participate. However, the Taliban did engage in casual discussions with the Afghan government during that year. On February 27, 2018, after a rise in violence, Afghan President Ashraf Ghani suggested starting peace negotiations with the Taliban, proposing they be recognized as a legitimate political entity and the release of Taliban prisoners. This proposal was the most generous towards the Taliban since the conflict began. It came after several months of building national consensus, which revealed that the majority of Afghans were in favor of seeking a peaceful resolution to the conflict. 2 days prior, the Taliban had expressed a desire to discuss with the US, stating, "It is imperative that America and her allies acknowledge that the Afghan problem cannot be resolved through military means. America should now shift its focus towards a peaceful approach for Afghanistan rather than resorting to war." US President Donald Trump made accusations against Pakistan for harboring the Taliban and for not taking sufficient action against terrorists, making these claims in August 2017 and January 2018. Deal with the US. On February 29, 2020, the US and Taliban reached a formal agreement known as the Agreement for Peace in Afghanistan, which was signed in Doha, Qatar. This agreement outlined several key points, including the withdrawal of all American and NATO forces from Afghanistan, a commitment from the Taliban to prevent al-Qaeda from operating within their territories, and discussions between the Taliban and the Afghan government. It was widely believed that Akhundzada celebrated the Doha Accords as a significant win. However, following the peace deal, there was a noticeable increase in insurgent attacks on Afghan security forces. Over a span of 45 days, from March 1 to April 15, 2020, the Taliban launched more than 4,500 attacks in Afghanistan, marking a more than 70% rise compared to the same period in the previous year. The negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban commenced in Doha on September 12, 2020. Originally scheduled for March, the talks were postponed due to disagreements over a prisoner exchange issue. Maulavi Abdul Hakim was the initial negotiator for the Taliban, with Abdullah playing a key role for the Afghan government. The Afghan government's negotiating team also included advocates for women's rights. 2021 offensive and return to power. By the middle of 2021, the Taliban had launched a significant campaign in Afghanistan as the US military was pulling out, securing control of more than half of the country's 421 districts by July 23, 2021. By August mid-2021, the Taliban had taken over all the major cities in Afghanistan. After almost capturing Kabul, the Taliban took over the presidential palace after the current president Ashraf Ghani escaped to the United Arab Emirates. The UAE Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation officially recognized Ghani's asylum on August 18, 2021. The Afghan military forces, led by Amrullah Saleh, Ahmad Massoud, and Bismillah Khan Mohammadi, regrouped in Panjshir to keep fighting. Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, 2021-present. The Taliban took control from a well-established government that was supported by some of the most advanced military forces in the world. As a movement driven by a strong belief in establishing a genuinely Islamic state, their triumph has been likened to that of the Chinese Communist Revolution in 1949 or the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Both of which led to a significant transformation of society. Yet, by 2021 to 2022, the top Taliban leaders have highlighted the gentleness of their movement and their wish for positive interactions with the United States during talks with American reporter John Lee Anderson. Anderson points out that the Taliban's aggressive stance against any negative symbols, which was strong in their early days, has been relaxed, possibly due to the rise of smartphones and social media platforms like Instagram. A local observer, Syed Hamid Gailani, has suggested that the Taliban have not committed many killings since coming back into power. Women can be seen on the streets, Zabihullah Mujahid, acting Deputy Minister of Information and Culture, mentioned that there are still women employed in several government departments and stated that girls will be permitted to continue their education once the government's finances are stabilized and arrangements can be made for separate educational facilities and transportation for them. When questioned regarding the execution of Hazara Shia by the initial Taliban government, Suhail Shaheen, the Taliban candidate for UN ambassador, responded to Anderson by stating, "The Hazara Shia are Muslims too. We see ourselves as part of the same community, like different flowers in a garden." In the latter part of 2021, reporters from the New York Times spent time with a Taliban group of 6 members assigned to guard the Shiite Sikhi shrine in Kabul against the Islamic State, observing the dedication with which the group approached their mission. The leader of the group mentioned, "Our duty is to serve and ensure the safety of Afghans, regardless of their ethnic background." In light of global criticism for not being diverse, a Hazara individual was named Deputy Health Minister, and a Tajik was chosen as Deputy Trade Minister. Conversely, the Ministry for Women's Affairs has been shut down, and its premises now serve as the new location for the Ministry for the Promotion of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice. Anderson mentions that some government-employed women are being compelled to clock in at their workplaces and then return home to maintain the appearance of fairness. Additionally, the hiring of individuals from ethnic minority groups by the Taliban has been criticized by a Taliban advisor as merely symbolic. There have been reports of Hazara agricultural workers being displaced from their properties by ethnic Pashtun, attacks on the homes of activists, and the extrajudicial killing of former government military and intelligence personnel. A report from Human Rights Watch, published in November 2021, states that since taking control, the Taliban have executed or forcibly disappeared over 100 former members of the Afghan security forces across 4 provinces, Ghazni, Helmand, Kandahar, and Kunduz. The report details how the Taliban selected their targets through intelligence gathering and by exploiting employment records left behind. Former security force members were also killed by the Taliban shortly after joining them, under the guise of providing them with a letter promising their safety. Despite the Taliban's assertions that they have defeated ISIS, the group continued to carry out suicide attacks in October 2021, targeting Shia mosques in Kunduz and Kandahar, resulting in the deaths of more than 115 individuals. As of late 2021, there were frequent sticky bomb incidents in Kabul, the capital. The reasons for the Taliban's more restrained approach and the statements from its leaders, such as, "We have initiated a new chapter. Our goal is to avoid getting caught up in history," suggest that they did not anticipate seizing control of the country so swiftly and were still dealing with internal divisions among their members, that $7 billion in Afghan government funds were blocked in U.S. banks, and that the 80% of the former government's budget, which relied on the United States, its allies, or international financiers, was cut off, leading to a severe economic downturn, as reported by the UN. As of late 2021 and early 2022, it was reported that approximately 22.8 million Afghans were facing severe food shortages, with 7 million on the brink of famine. The global community has collectively called on the Taliban to establish a government that includes all groups, respects women's and minority rights, and ensures Afghanistan does not become a base for international terrorist activities before acknowledging their rule. In an interview with journalist Anderson, top Taliban officials suggested that the strict enforcement of Islamic law during their initial period in power in the 1990s was justified due to the perceived degradation and disorder left by the Soviet invasion. However, they now emphasize a policy of compassion and kindness. This stance was challenged by ex-officials from the Ministry of Women's Affairs, who mentioned to Anderson that they are willing to do whatever it takes to secure international funding, but they fear they may have to return to wearing the burqa. They described the situation as a wait-and-see scenario. Following the Taliban's resurgence in 2021, conflicts along the borders with Iran and Pakistan intensified, resulting in injuries on both the Taliban and their neighbors. In the initial stages of Taliban governance, foreign reporters managed to gain some access to Afghanistan. However, by February 2022, a group of foreign journalists, including Andrew North, were arrested. The Committee to Protect Journalists characterized their arrest as a grim indication of the deteriorating state of press freedom and the growing threats to journalists during Taliban rule. The journalists were eventually freed after a few days. Following this, various organizations have continued to report on the arrests of local reporters and the restrictions placed on foreign journalists. The nation's minority Sikh population, which ranks as Afghanistan's second-largest religious group, along with Hindus, have been reportedly denied the opportunity to celebrate their festivals by the Taliban government in 2023. Despite this, the Taliban later acknowledged these communities, promising to protect their private lands and properties. In April 2024, the last Sikh member of parliament, Narendra Singh Khalsa, made his first return to Afghanistan since the fall of the republic. Current education policy. In September 2021, the authorities mandated that elementary schools for both genders should resume operations. However, they did not make a firm promise to do the same for secondary schools for girls. The Taliban have indicated that they will allow female university students to continue their studies as long as they are kept separate from male students and faculty, if feasible. The Guardian pointed out that if secondary schools for girls remain closed, the promises made regarding university education would lose their significance once the current group of students completes their studies. Abdul Baqi Haqqani, the Minister of Higher Education, mentioned that female university students would need to adhere to hijab standards, though he did not clarify whether this meant covering their faces. Kabul University began its operations again in February 2022, with female students attending classes in the morning and male students in the afternoon. The only notable change reported was the suspension of the music department. There were minor adjustments to the course offerings. Female students were officially mandated to wear an abaya and a hijab to be present on campus, though some opted for a shawl instead. The turnout for the first day of classes was reported to be low. In March 2022, the Taliban suddenly stopped their plans to let girls go back to secondary school education, even if they were separated from boys. At that time, the Washington Post mentioned that, besides university students, the 6th grade is now the highest level girls can reach in school. The Afghan Ministry of Education mentioned that they couldn't agree on a suitable design for girls' school uniforms. On December 20, 2022, the Taliban broke their previous commitments by stopping girls from going to college right away. The next day, December 21, 2022, the Taliban also stopped all girls and women from getting an education, along with banning female teachers in schools, including those who teach. Teaching was one of the few jobs left for women. Ideology and aims. The Taliban's belief system has been characterized as a unique blend of Pashtun tribal customs, known as Pashtunwali, and extreme interpretations of Islam popular among Deobandi scholars and their offshoots, such as Jamiat Ulama-e-Islam. This blend marked a departure from the Islamism of the mujahideen leaders who fought against the Soviet Union and the extreme Islamists influenced by Sayyid Qutb Ikhwan. The Taliban declared their goal to bring back peace and security in Afghanistan, including the withdrawal of Western forces and the implementation of Sharia law upon seizing power. In the initial stages of their governance, the Taliban embraced Deobandi and Islamist views that were anti-nationalist, rejecting tribal and feudal structures by ousting traditional tribal or feudal leaders from positions of authority. The Taliban rigorously applied their principles in major urban centers like Herat, Kabul, and Kandahar. However, in the countryside, their influence was minimal, leading them to rely on village jirgas for governance. This approach meant that their ideology was not as strictly enforced in rural areas as it was in cities. Ideological influences. The Taliban's religious and political beliefs, particularly during its initial period from 1996 to 2001, were significantly shaped by the guidance and influence of Grand Mufti Rashid Ahmed Ludhianvi and his writings. However, the core political and religious tenets of the Taliban, from its inception, were based on those of Abul Ala Maududi and the Jamiyat Islami movement. Influence of Pashtun culture. As the Taliban predominantly consisted of Pashtun tribes, they often adhere to a pre-Islamic tribal code emphasizing the preservation of honor. This code, known as Pashtunwali, plays a significant role in guiding decisions regarding social issues. It can be seen as deeply ingrained social values and attitudes that encourage traits like courage, the preservation of honor, hospitality towards guests, the pursuit of justice and revenge for wrongs done, and offering refuge to those in need, even to enemies. Nonetheless, these values are often criticized by non-Pashtun and others, particularly for practices like the Pashtun tradition of dividing a man's inheritance equally among his sons, despite the Quran's instruction that women should receive half of a man's share. Ali F. Jalali and Lester Grouse state that the Taliban garnered widespread backing from Pashtun nationwide, who believed the group could regain their country's supremacy. Even Pashtun scholars living in the West, who had their disagreements with the Taliban on various matters, showed their support for the group based solely on ethnic considerations. Islamic rules under Deobandi philosophy. Documents released by the Commission of Cultural Affairs of the Taliban movement, such as Islami Adalat, de Mujahideen, de Jihad Shari Misale, and Guidance to the Mujahideen, laid out the fundamental beliefs of the Taliban movement on jihad, Sharia, structure, and behavior. The Taliban government applied the principles of Sharia law following the Hanafi school of Islamic law and the teachings of Mullah Omar. Mullah Omar, in particular, highlighted the significance of dreams as a form of divine communication. Prohibitions. The Taliban prohibited the eating of pork and drinking alcohol, the use of various consumer technologies like music with instruments, television, movies, photography, and the internet, as well as most art forms such as paintings and photographs. They also banned participation in sports, including soccer and chess, and recreational activities like flying kites and keeping pigeons and other animals. According to the Taliban's guidelines, birds were to be killed. Movie theaters were shut down and converted into mosques. The festivities of Western and Iranian New Year's were also off-limits. The taking of photos and showing of images and portraits were also prohibited, as the Taliban viewed them as acts of idolatry. This rule even applied to covering up illustrations on baby soap packages in stores and painting over signs for animals crossing roads. Women were not allowed to work, and girls were not permitted to go to schools or universities. They were expected to adhere to purdah, a separation of genders, and aura, covering oneself with clothing, and to be accompanied by male family members when outside their homes. Violations of these rules were met with punishment. Men were prohibited from trimming their facial hair, and they were also mandated to allow it to grow and maintain its length as per the Taliban's regulations. Additionally, they were expected to don turbans when outside their homes. Fasting became mandatory, and individuals who failed to adhere to the religious duty following the call to prayer faced arrest. The practice of gambling was outlawed, and the Taliban executed criminals by cutting off their hands or feet. In 2000, Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban, declared a ban on the cultivation of opium and the trafficking of drugs in Afghanistan. By 2001, the Taliban had nearly wiped out the opium production, achieving a 99% reduction. During the Taliban's rule over Afghanistan, both drug users and dealers were subjected to harsh punishment. Views on the Bamiyan Buddhists. In 1999, Mullah Omar issued a proclamation urging the safeguarding of the Buddha statues at Bamiyan, which included two 6th-century colossal statues of seated Buddhas sculpted into the cliff face of the Bamiyan Valley in the Hazarajat area of central Afghanistan. However, in March 2001, the Taliban demolished the statues, following a directive from Mullah Omar that declared, all statues throughout Afghanistan must be obliterated. Yahya Massoud, the brother of Ahmad Shah Massoud, a leader in the opposition to the Taliban and the Afghan resistance, remembers the event following the destruction of the Buddha statues at Bamiyan. It was the spring of 2001. I was in Afghanistan's Panjshir Valley, alongside my brother Ahmad Shah Massoud, the head of the Afghan resistance against the Taliban, and Bismillah Khan, who at the time was Afghanistan's interior minister. A leader among us, Commandant Momin, had arranged for us to observe 30 Taliban members who had been captured following a shootout. My brother consented to this mission. I recall his initial inquiry was about the ancient Buddha statues that had been destroyed by the Taliban in March of that year, just before our meeting. Two Taliban fighters from Kandahar assured us that any form of worship not aligned with Islam was not tolerated and that as a result, these statues were to be demolished. My brother looked at them and, this time in Pashto, asked, "There are still many people who worship the sun. Will you also attempt to eliminate the sun and bring darkness upon the earth?" Views on Bacha-Batsi. The Afghan tradition of Bacha-Batsi, a type of sexual exploitation and pedophilia involving young boys, was banned during the Taliban's 6-year period in power. Following the Taliban's rule, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan imposed the death penalty for engaging in Bacha-Batsi, a practice where older men sexually abuse young boys known as dancing boys. During the era of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, the practice of Bacha-Batsi was technically illegal, yet the enforcement of these laws was rare, especially against influential perpetrators, and it was reported that some police officers were involved in these crimes. A dispute emerged during the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan's tenure when it was revealed that U.S. forces in Afghanistan after the country's invasion deliberately overlooked Bacha-Batsi. The U.S. military defended their stance by stating that the majority of the abuse was committed by the Afghan government. The Taliban has criticized the U.S. for its involvement in the mistreatment of Afghan children. Attitudes towards other Muslim communities. Different from other groups with fundamentalist Islamic beliefs, the Taliban do not identify as Salafists. Even though rich Arab countries introduced Salafist educational institutions, known as madrassas, to Afghanistan during the Soviet conflict in the 1980s, the Taliban's hardline Deobandi leaders put a halt to the spread of Salafism in Afghanistan after they took control in the 1990s. After the U.S. military took over in 2001, the Taliban and Salafists united to fight NATO forces, but Salafists ended up in minor groups under Taliban leadership. The Taliban are not open to discussions about their beliefs with other Muslims and did not permit Muslim reporters to challenge their decisions or engage in discussions about the interpretation of the Quran. Resistance to Salafism. After taking over, the Taliban initiated a campaign across the country to target Salafist groups believed to have connections with ISIS-K. They shut down numerous Salafist mosques and schools in 16 provinces, including Nangarhar, and imprisoned religious leaders they accused of backing the Islamic State.